Welcome to Shad's Guitar Show. Whether it's the gear or the players who made the gear famous, this podcast is about all things guitar. Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome into this episode of Shad's Guitar Show. So glad to have you joining me today for a little discussion on a part of your guitar that we all know about, but I don't think we spend a whole lot of time discussing. And as with other things, that make up a guitar, I think a lot of times we know what something is, but maybe not exactly what it does. So today we're going to dive into the world of capacitors. What is a capacitor? What does it do? And why does it matter? At its core, a capacitor is an electronic component that stores and releases electrical energy. In a guitar, it lives almost exclusively in your tone circuit. Here's the simple version. Your tone knob controls how much high-frequency signal is sent to ground. The capacitor determines which frequencies get removed and how fast that roll-off happens. When your tone knob is wide open, like on 10, the capacitor is basically out of the circuit. But as you roll the tone knob back, more treble is shunted to ground through the capacitor, leaving you with a warmer, darker tone. So the capacitor doesn't add tone, it actually subtracts treble in a controlled way. Capacitor values are measured in microfarads. The value you choose determines how aggressively high frequencies are rolled off. So let's talk capacitor values. The most common that we find are 0.022 microfarad, which you mostly find in humbucker-equipped guitars, and 0.047, which is a little more standard that you find in single coil guitars. There's also 0.015 microfarads, and that has a much more subtle treble roll-off. And there's also 0.1 microfarad, which was more common in vintage instruments, but we don't see it hardly ever now. So basically, the smaller the value, the greater the treble cut. And that's why changing a capacitor value can make your tone knob feel more usable. Even with the same capacitor value, tone knobs can behave differently due to pot values, pot taper, and wiring style. And this is why two guitars with the same cap can feel wildly different. The capacitor is only part of a larger tone shaping system. So let's talk about the types of guitar capacitors, the physical construction of capacitors, and where a lot of the mythology comes in. Ceramic disc capacitors are very inexpensive. They're common in lower-end modern guitars. They can sound slightly harsher when rolled down, but they're perfectly functional despite their sometimes bad reputation. Next we have film capacitor, polyester or polypropylene. More consistent tolerances, smoother roll-off, extremely popular for upgrades, often labeled as orange drop style caps. And then we have paper in oil, or PIO. Vintage construction, oil impregnated paper, dielectric, smoother, more gradual roll-off, and highly prized in vintage and boutique circles. And a few brands you've probably heard of, Sprague, which makes the orange drop. They have that characteristic bright orange casing. They're polypropylene film capacitors, very consistent and durable, clear, predictable roll-off, and often a go-to choice for people doing mods. Jensen paper and oil. These are high-end paper and oil capacitors, very smooth musical roll-off, and they're popular in vintage style builds. The Mallory 150 series, polyester film capacitors. They're warm with classic voicing, often associated with vintage Fender tones. Cornell Dublier, CDE. These are the makers of vintage correct PIO caps, found in boutique builds, extremely consistent quality. And there's a bunch of different boutique and replica cap makers doing the Bumblebee style replicas. And even though there are different kinds of capacitors, the value of the capacitor has a much more dramatic effect than the type or brand. Two capacitors of the same value but different materials can feel different when you roll the tone knob down, but they won't radically change your sound with the tone knob wide open. The biggest upgrade most players notice is going from a harsh or sudden roll-off to a more smooth and usable sweep. So how do you choose the right capacitor for your guitar? Well, here are some common best practices and starting points. With a Telecaster or a Strat, usually a 0.047 microfarad ceramic or film capacitor. A Les Paul bridge pickup, usually a 0.022 microfarad film or paper in oil. For a Les Paul neck pickup, 0.015 microfarad to avoid some of the mud associated with a dark sounding neck humbucker. In a jazz guitar, usually a 0.022 or 0.033 microfarad capacitor with smooth taper pods. And for vintage style guitar builds, paper and oil or Mallory style caps are common. And remember, capacitors are cheap. Experimenting is part of the fun. So try a few different ones to find out which one sounds best to your ears. But again, this really only matters if you're somebody who uses your tone knob, because if you have the tone knob at 10 all the time, the capacitor brand or type or value really doesn't matter because it's not really affecting anything until you start rolling the tone knob down. It's kind of amazing that one of the most debated tone components in the guitar costs generally less than a set of new strings. But that's the beauty of guitars, small changes that can have big musical consequences. Your capacitor doesn't define your tone, but it defines how usable your tone control is. And once you experience a smooth musical roll-off, it's hard to go back. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure and share it with your fellow guitar nerds. And please be sure to subscribe and follow me on socials, Instagram, Shad's Guitar Show, and Shad's Guitar Show on YouTube. Please subscribe. And you know what? Let me know in the comments below what cap values you're running in your favorite guitar.